All right. All right. Good evening. Okay. So good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Baker Institute. Tonight's event is sponsored by our newly launched Center for the Middle East. And for those of you who are, if this is the first time you've been to the Baker Institute, the Middle East Center builds on the Baker Institute's longstanding engagement with the Middle East and provides support for research, lectures, conferences, and affiliations with other experts and organizations confronting policy challenges in the Arab world. The center encompasses research programs addressing key policy areas, including Syria, the Israel-Palestinian peace negotiations, the political economy of the Gulf, and the role of women in the countries of the region and the implications of the Arab awakenings. And tonight's speaker is one of the best analysts on the region's politics today. Shadi Hamid is a fellow with the Project on the U.S. Relations with the Islamic World in the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. He served as the Director of Research at Brookings Doha Center until this past January. Prior to joining Brookings, Shadi was Director of Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or it's known in the shorthand as POMED, and the Hewlett Fellow at Stanford University's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. Shadi is currently Vice Chairman of POMED, a member of the World Bank's MENA Advisory Panel, and a correspondent for The Atlantic. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Foreign Policy, The New Republic, Slate, Forbes, The National Interest, and many other publications. Shadi received his BA and MA from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and his PhD in political science from Oxford. Over 3 years since the Arab awakenings began, Shadi's new book, Temptations of Power, Islamists and Illiberal Democracy in a New Middle East, published by Oxford University Press, offers an important assessment of the nature and evolution of Islamist movements, but also examines the challenges and opportunities facing these movements going forward. Shadi makes a compelling case for why Islamist movements' embracement of the electoral and political process has not resulted in the creation of constitutionally liberal democracies, but instead have resulted in illiberal democracies. In doing so, this has led to a degree of overreach and backlash, as Shadi argues. However, he also argues that the recent events in Egypt shouldn't be seen as an obituary for Islamist politics, and these movements are important stakeholders in the politics of the region. So for this evening, Shadi will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions. Following tonight's program, there will be a reception as long as a book signing. And I encourage all of you to purchase the book. It's excellent and probably one of the better books that have come out on the Arab awakenings. And thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Andrew, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Baker Institute for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. This is my first time at Rice University. So let me just kind of start by setting some of the context for what I tried to do in this book. Really, it was 10 years in the making. I was living in Jordan 2004-2005, conducting research on the Muslim Brotherhood there. And I was a young, naive graduate student at the time, and I would just kind of hang out with Islamists pretty much. And I spent a lot of time, sometimes, every day or every other day at the Muslim Brotherhood's headquarters, and I would just kind of immerse myself in their archives, looking at documents and articles, and they were always a little bit confused. Who is this guy, and why does he care about us so much? And for them, it was a bit odd, because at the time, this wasn't really a hot topic. It was obviously before the Arab Spring, and the Jordanian Islamists in particular don't get a lot of attention. So I was actually the only Western researcher focusing on Islamist movements in Jordan at the time. And quite honestly, ever since then, I've been hooked. I've been fascinated by these movements. Now, I kind of come at this from the standpoint that we don't have to like Islamist movements, but we do have to understand them. And the only way to understand them, I think, is to do something very simple, to sit down with them, talk to them, get to know them as real people. And I think it's unfortunate that a lot of the commentary you see on Islamist movements, including from Washington, D.C., is from commentators who, in some cases, have never actually met a real live Islamist. They are real people. Now, I want to start with a quote from someone you all know, ex-Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. So I got to know him a little bit before he became president. I met him for the first time on May 8th, 2010. And he's not the most interesting, or he wasn't the most interesting, he wasn't a great strategic thinker, but he was a kind of brotherhood loyalist enforcer. He was important in the organization, but not exceptional. But he was exceptional in one way. He's the only Muslim Brotherhood leader I've met with who's done impromptu impressions of former U.S. presidents. I won't mention who he does an impression of, actually Jimmy Carter. Well, he did live in the U.S. A little bit, so he would kind of name check certain American movies and things like that, sometimes in an awkward way. Anyway, this first time I met with him, I described the Muslim Brotherhood as an opposition group. And keep in mind, this was 7-8 months before the Arab Spring began. And actually, during this period, repression was getting worse. Mubarak was being more aggressive against the Brotherhood and trying to marginalize and push them outside the political process. So I described the Brotherhood as an opposition group, but Morsi objected to this in our conversation. This is what he told me, quote unquote, "The word opposition has the connotation of seeking power, but at this moment we are not seeking power because that requires preparation, and society is not prepared." And it's remarkable to kind of look back and see him saying this, and just in the matter of 2 years, he would rise to become Egypt's first democratically elected head of state. But you see in that statement the Brotherhood's traditional gradualism, caution. They were very careful about not getting too ahead of themselves. Similarly, Rashid Ghannouchi, the head of Tunisia's main Islamist party, Ennahda, said something years ago when he was in exile. The most dangerous thing, he said, is for Islamists to be loved by the people before they come to power and hated afterwards. When I was finishing up the writing of this book last year, I was going back to some old recordings, and I stumbled upon one conversation I had with another Brotherhood official, but this time after the Arab Spring. This was in May 2011. I was sitting down with Assam Arian, and most of these people are in prison now. Arian and Morsi are both in prison, facing God knows how long in jail. What was fascinating about this conversation, 3 months after Mubarak fell, was this quote, and I cite this in the book. So Arian tells me, quote unquote, "The people won't accept an Islamist president." That's what they were saying just a few months after the Arab Spring began. I mentioned these quotes for a reason. I decided to go for the title of Temptations of Power. Temptations of Power. Because the Brotherhood insisted that they knew better. They had this history of caution, yet for a variety of reasons, they succumbed to the temptations of power. And I like this idea because it's something that all of us, or most of us, can relate to, whether it's in our careers or in our personal lives, this idea that while we're doing something, we know it's a bad idea, we know we shouldn't be doing it, but then after we do it, we regret that decision. So the Brotherhood was certainly not immune to this. Now, let me fast forward a little bit. So my book essentially covers more or less the late 70s until August 2013. And I chose August 2013 as the bookend for a reason. I think it's an appropriate bookend because on August 14th, 2013, we see what Human Rights Watch calls the worst mass killing in modern Egyptian history. So we kind of see this very striking reversal of fortune. Now, I was in Egypt just a few days before the massacre happened. So President Morsi, as many of you know, was ousted by a military coup on July 3rd. They got a lot of their supporters to protest in a particular part of Cairo. So I went to this place, to this sit-in, and it was called Rabaa. And I saw Assam Larian, who I mentioned, the guy who said that the people won't accept an Islamist president. I saw him a few days before the massacre there. And what was, I think, really striking about that meeting, well, first of all, he looked more calm and comfortable than I ever remember seeing him, which was odd because there was an impending massacre. And actually, when he came down to see me, I usually would see him wearing a shirt or a suit or, something a little bit more formal, but he kind of walks down and he's wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants, and he looks super chill. So I was very confused about this. There was another Brotherhood official I met that day, Jihad al-Haddad, who was one of the Brotherhood spokespeople, also now in prison. He told me that he felt, quote unquote, very much at peace. Now, I mention this because there was almost, even though they were being repressed, the crackdown was in full speed ahead against them. It was almost as if they were back in their original state, the state of opposition, and they felt that this was the purer state. And the 1 year that they were in power was a kind of aberration. They didn't feel totally comfortable in power. This wasn't what they were used to, but they were conditioned to really 80 years in opposition, facing various degrees of repression. So in a sense, they were returning to this state. Now, they didn't know how bad the crackdown would be, and then we see Egypt entering into a new and very tragic phase. So essentially what I try to do in the book is look at the Brotherhood and other Islamist groups as they go through these different phases, whether it's the phase of opposition under intensifying repression or under democratic openings, and trying to understand how these groups evolve and change over time, how they respond to different pressures and incentives. Now, in tracking the evolution of the Muslim Brotherhood in both Egypt and Jordan, I saw something quite interesting, that over a period of time, in particular in the 1990s and 2000s, the Brotherhood in both countries becomes more moderate. We see a process of moderation, and I focus on several indicators, including they de-emphasize Sharia law, Islamic law, in their political program. They embrace many of the tenets of democratic life, alternation of power, popular sovereignty, and so on. They reach out like never before to liberal and leftist groups, and they democratize their internal organizational structures. But the question I wanted to ask was, how and why did this process of moderation happen? And contrary to much of the academic and popular wisdom, I argue that repression, rather than having a radicalizing effect, as you might expect, actually forced Islamist groups to become more moderate over time. So I draw this linkage between repression and moderation, and I call this forced moderation. Now, this isn't to say that all kinds of repression have a moderating effect, but it happens under certain conditions, and I try to outline what those conditions are that lead to Islamist moderation over time. Now, in the book, I kind of go through various causal factors. I don't want to go too much into that. It's a complex and somewhat controversial argument. For the full treatment of that, I discuss this at length in chapter 2 of the book. Now, I want to move on to the flip side of this. So that's the effect that repression can have under certain conditions. But what about when you have democratic openings? What kind of effect does that have on Islamist parties? Now, the conventional wisdom here, and much of the academic literature as well, for example, if you look at Western Europe and Latin America, we see ideological parties, socialist or Christian Democrats, moving to the center as a result of a democratic process. And this is in some sense intuitive, that if they want to win elections, they have to reach out to independent voters and build broad-based coalitions. And you do that by moving to the center. That's also what political scientists sometimes refer to as median voter theory. Now, a lot of the academic literature made a similar argument when it came to Islamists, that the more you include Islamists in a democratic process, the more moderate they will become. And this wasn't just in the academic literature, it also became part of our public and popular discourse. And I want to quote you something from another ex-president, but luckily this one is not in prison, George W. Bush. George W. Bush. So this is actually a very interesting quote. I also just stumbled upon this as I was finishing up the book. So he's responding to a question about Hezbollah's participation in Lebanese politics. This was in 2005, and Hezbollah is the main Islamist party, Shia Islamist party in Lebanon. So George W. said this, quote unquote, "I like the idea of people running for office. There's a positive effect. Maybe some will run for office and say, 'Vote for me. I look forward to blowing up America.' But I don't think so. I think people who generally run for office say, 'Vote for me. I'm looking forward to fixing your potholes.'" Also known as the pothole theory of democracy. And I'm kind of not joking. Actually, there are academic articles now which actually cite the pothole theory of democracy. But to be fair, Bush is drawing upon an academic literature that essentially argues that if ideological groups have responsibilities for governing and fixing potholes, that forces them in a more moderate, pragmatic direction. But I found something a little bit different in my research, and I argue against this conventional wisdom. I looked at some forgotten periods in Egyptian and Jordanian history where you have brief but significant democratic openings. So in Egypt in the early to mid 1980s, and in Jordan from 1989 to 1993. So what I found was that Islamist groups actually moved further to the right under these democratic openings. So for example, we see the Muslim Brotherhood in the mid-80s really having this almost obsessive focus on Sharia law. And when I was reading their political programs from that period, I was struck by this much more raw religiosity, which wasn't what you saw in the 90s and 2000s. Or in Jordan, in 1991, there was a very brief period where the Brotherhood joined a coalition government. They had 5 ministries, and they also had a plurality in the Jordanian parliament. In this first half of 1991, and again, this doesn't get much attention, they, for example, introduced 3 pieces of controversial legislation. Just to give you a little taste of this, legislation banning alcohol, legislation banning interest, and legislation banning co-education on the primary, secondary, and university levels. They also, this is a little bit more symbolic and a little bit petty, but they also tried to pass legislation barring male hairdressers from cutting women's hair in kind of unisex or female salons. When they were in control of the Ministry of Education, the Islamist minister actually, for a brief period of time, barred fathers from attending their daughters' sporting events. Again, the idea here was to segregate and keep men and women at least somewhat separate. Now, this also extends to the Arab Spring, another period of democratic opening. And if you look at Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood's 1 year of power, you see them moving to the right. You see them becoming more illiberal, emphasizing Islamist rhetoric, moving towards ultra-conservative Salafi parties, so on and so forth. Now, why would this be the case? Why aren't Islamists moving to the center? Why are they moving further to the right in these democratic settings? There are a couple factors, and I'll just mention them briefly here. One is that these are deeply conservative societies. So if you come to power through democratic elections, you have to in some way be responsive to popular sentiment. That's part of what democracy is about. And what we look at and what nearly all the polling data we have makes pretty clear that there is widespread support for Islam and Islamic law playing more of a role in public life, not less. And if there is a demand for this, someone has to supply it, right? Let me give you a couple examples from the polling data. From a 2011 Pew poll, 74% of Egyptian respondents said they believed that Sharia should be, quote unquote, the official law of the land. In a 2010 Arab Barometer poll in Jordan, 62% of Jordanian respondents said they supported, quote unquote, a system governed by Islamic law in which there are no parties or elections. Striking numbers. Let's talk about gender equality for a second. In a March 2012 YouGov poll, only 18% of Egyptian respondents said they would support a female candidate for president. And you might say, well, what about Egyptian women? Maybe there's a discrepancy according to gender. Only 24% of Egyptian women said they would support another woman becoming head of state. Lastly, a 2011 Gallup poll in Egypt where 69% of Egyptians said that religious leaders should advise those in authority with writing national legislation. Another 14% said that religious leaders should have full authority drafting national legislation. Let me see if my math is good. 69 plus 14% is 83%. That's a big chunk of the population. Okay, so that's one factor. Also, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood have to be more responsive to their conservative base. And this leads to what I call a Tea Party effect, referring to our own experience here in the US. So this is not totally unique to the Middle East, where essentially you have to respond to your conservative base. That's part of it. But also, you see the proliferation of ultra-conservative Salafi parties on the Brotherhood's right flank. So they no longer have a monopoly on the conservative vote. They have to compete with other groups, so you have a kind of religious outbidding, similar to what you have on the right side of the spectrum here in the US, where the Tea Party drags the center-right Republicans further to the right. Well, what about the potholes? Was Bush wrong about this? Is the academic literature wrong about the importance of fixing potholes? Part of what you have, especially in young democracies, well, first of all, in a place like Egypt with 85 million people, fixing the potholes is pretty much impossible. So you're not going to fix the potholes. So if you can't deliver economic progress and you can't demonstrate clear, tangible improvements in people's lives, then you're actually more likely to fall back on ideology, populism, hyper-nationalism, xenophobia. And this actually fits into another strand in academic literature. Some of you might be familiar with Mansfield and Snyder's work, where they essentially argue that young democracies are actually more warlike. They're more prone to aggression, to engaging in aggressive action against their neighbors. Why? Because they can't absorb popular demands through domestic policy, so they kind of divert their constituency's attention by engaging in these kinds of misadventures or adventures or whatever you want to call them. Now, this all leads me to the second part of the book's title, Illiberal Democracy. So if democratization is pushing Islamist groups further to the right, what does that mean? I do believe that Islamist groups are committed to the democratic process and to democracy, but that does not mean they're liberal or that they'll become liberals anytime soon. In fact, they can use the democratic process to pursue illiberal ends, whether it's on gender equality, protection of minority rights, the role of religion in public life, restricting alcohol consumption, sex segregation, using the state to promote a particular conception of religion, so on and so forth. And this kind of leads to a question that I would pose to all of you. Do Arabs have the right to decide through the democratic process that they would rather not be liberals? I'll let you ponder that for a moment while I just have a glass of... There isn't necessarily one answer to this question. I come out on one particular side of this debate, and I'll get to that in a moment. Another way to pose this question, to think about it, do Arabs have the right to try out an alternative ideological project? Do people have the right to do that? And of course, you're probably familiar with Francis Fukuyama's work, 1989, The End of History, where he argues that the final endpoint of human civilization is liberal democracy. This is it. This is the only option that's left. But in the Middle East, there does seem to be another option. So we have to contend with this question: what if people don't want to stay within the confines of liberal democracy? Now, let me just illustrate how this kind of manifests itself in everyday politics and why this is such a thorny dilemma to try to resolve. So when Morsi was president, he oversaw the drafting of a constitution in Egypt. This was in 2012. Very controversial. So essentially, the Brotherhood was in the middle. You had Salafis on the right and liberals on the left, and the Brotherhood was kind of sandwiched. Now, the Salafis were threatening to withdraw from the Constituent Assembly if the wording wasn't changed from the principles of Sharia, are the primary source of legislation, to the rulings, so stronger language. So the rulings of Sharia are the primary source of legislation. Now, the Brotherhood didn't want to go that far. That was going to be pretty controversial, so they came up with a compromise article in the Constitution, Article 219, which essentially clarified the meaning of Sharia, but in a somewhat restrictive way, but not as far as the Salafis wanted. They thought this was a compromise. But actually, it frightened and alienated liberals and other non-Islamists in the Constituent Assembly, ultimately contributing to their withdrawal from the assembly. So Morsi could have done more to encourage consensus and to be more inclusive. He could have done much more. I don't deny that. But was consensus really possible when you have two irreconcilable conceptions of the good? The Salafi notion on the right and the liberal notion on the left. Liberals, by definition, believe that certain rights and freedoms are non-negotiable. Salafis believe that state interference in your private life is also non-negotiable. We have a problem. How do you resolve that? How do you square the circle on that? It's not just an issue of differing policies. This is about the very philosophical basis of the nation state. Now, liberals would say that their solution is the only acceptable solution. It's the compromise solution. Because in a liberal society, everyone, Salafi or secular alike, can express their religious preferences. That's what we have here in this country. It's a liberal democracy, and we have the whole spectrum, right? But the notion that liberalism is neutral can only be accepted within a liberal framework. That's the problem. Because Islamists cannot fully express their Islamism in a liberal society. They can't. Because we're talking again about two different normative conceptions of the good, of what society should and can be. It's difficult for us as Americans, because for us in our own history, liberalism and democracy went hand in hand. We established a foundation of constitutional liberalism, and then and only then did we move to democracy in the sense of universal suffrage and full equal rights for all of our citizens. They go together in our own context, but they don't necessarily go together in the Middle East. Now, perhaps Tunisia is a relative bright spot and maybe provides an alternative path forward. And I want to just talk about Tunisia for a minute before I close up. Now, Tunisia is really the only positive example in the Arab Spring. Their transition is moving forward. There is hope. But there is a darker undercurrent. Islamists there, the Ennahda party, made compromise after compromise, including on the constitution. There were 3 Islamic clauses. They withdrew all 3 of them. One of them was about Sharia. But it was remarkable to see an Islamist party essentially accepting a constitution with no mention of the word Sharia. Big step. They deserve credit for that. They made a big compromise. But what's concerning about Tunisia is that despite all of those ideological concessions, the secular opposition over the summer was still trying to bring them down through undemocratic means, through mass protests and calling for the dissolution of the parliament and the government, which was then led by the Ennahda party. The Ennahda party ultimately stepped down from power voluntarily, But it raises the question, what if they win in the next elections and they feel they have to be more responsive to their conservative base? Because you have Ennahda members saying, well, we voted for you because you're Islamist. Where's the Islamism? So Tunisia is successful, but in Tunisia, Islamists had to effectively give up their Islamism in order to be a part of the democratic process and keep the democratic process going. And that poses the question, is it fair or is it democratic to expect Islamists to give up their Islamism to be a part of the political process? Should they? Do they have to? Now, it's not just that Islamists are responding to their conservative base, they're not just responding to electoral imperatives. What I wanted to do in this book was take seriously the ideas and ideology of Islamists. And again, as Americans, we're not always comfortable with that, of really kind of emphasizing the importance of religion. But Islamists believe in something, and it's deeply and honestly felt. They do, in fact, have a distinctive worldview. They do, in fact, have a distinctive vision for society. It might be a little bit vague because they haven't had a lot of models to draw on, but they do have a different vision. And I would argue, as I argue in the book, that Islamists are Islamists for a reason, that by definition, Islamist parties are at least somewhat illiberal. That's sort of the point. Now, let me close by offering two options. So we have a dilemma, and I'll give you two options for how to solve it. One is repression. If you think that Islamists are simply an existential threat and that liberalism is so important that you have to essentially undo democracy, then repression can be an option. Now, I personally have a moral objection to repression, but putting that aside, let's just think about it practically. Can you actually eradicate Islamists? You can't. They're deeply entrenched in their societies, and they reflect something real in these societies. It's been tried before in the 50s under Nasser, in Syria in the 80s, in Tunisia in the 90s, this effort to eradicate Islamists from society. It can work for the short term, but it's not sustainable. And even in Syria, where you had a political opening in 2011, the Brotherhood was eradicated, but they were able to reemerge quite quickly, and now they're one of the strongest political forces in the country. So there's this illusion that you can eradicate Islamists, but you really can't. It's one thing to kill an organization. It's an altogether different matter to kill an idea. Killing ideas is difficult. The other option, and the one that I would support, it's not ideal, it has its own problems, but I think it's preferable, is that we have to accept and come to terms with the notion that if democracy is going to flourish in the Middle East, it's going to have to at least be somewhat illiberal. We have to accept some form of illiberal democracy. As someone who's long been a pro-democracy advocate, advocating that the U.S. should more proactively support democracy in the Middle East, this makes my argument more difficult because democracy is actually less attractive for us as Americans in the Middle East, because not only are we small d Democrats, we're also, at least most of us, small l liberals, in the sense that, we think liberalism is the classical liberalism, not the kind of left liberalism, is a better way to organize societies. So these two commitments that we have as Americans are coming into conflict. So it makes the case for democracy more difficult, but I think this is a dilemma that we have to confront head on. And we also have to problematize this notion that good things go together. Sometimes good things don't go together. Sometimes you have to make a choice. And I'll close there. Thank you. How do you want to do this?
Question.
Yeah,
so
sure.
You're welcome to do a first question.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to call on people, or should I call?
You're welcome.
Okay, right here.
Yeah. Two questions, I guess. The most obvious one, could you define what you mean by Islamist? I mean, I think I have an idea, but what is your definition, number one? The second question is how similar are the Brotherhood in Egypt versus Jordan? Do they think the same? They have the same goals, or is there a difference in different command structure?
Sure. Sure, thank you. So I define Islamists as individuals or groups that believe that Islam and Islamic law should play a more central role in society. There are more specific definitions, but that's, I think, the best way to look at it. And obviously, that's not just one thing. Within that kind of definition, you have a whole spectrum of Islamist groups, from the more kind of progressive side to the more hard line. And of course, you also have a distinction between nonviolent Islamists and violent ones. So, Al-Qaeda are Islamist, but they use terrorism. The vast majority of Islamist movements are actually nonviolent, groups like the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood is kind of the original Islamist movement, and many of the other groups we talk about in the region are either descendants or affiliates of the original Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Now, how do they kind of differ from one context to another? Quite considerably, actually. The Jordanian Brotherhood is operating and has operated for decades within a very different context than their counterparts in Egypt. And that can mean that they might have a better relationship with ruling regimes. It might mean they emphasize some issues over others. So, for example, the Jordanian Brotherhood is very much defined by its approach to Palestine, because the majority of Jordanians are of Palestinian origin. So that's a much more urgent issue for Islamists in Jordan. If we, I'm just worried that was me or something. Okay. In Tunisia, as I mentioned, you see the Islamist party there making serious concessions and demonstrating a lot of flexibility and pragmatism, and trying to take a different approach than the more aggressive style of the Brotherhood in Egypt. So that's why I think a lot of people look at Tunisian Islamists as a kind of model, that's the way to go. And why are they more moderate? One of the reasons is the context that they're part of. Tunisia has a strong French secular influence. There's a much stronger secular opposition. So Islamists face more limits when they're executing their agenda. They have to be more cognizant of those limits. And also, there was a process of forced secularization in Tunisia for really 5 decades, and that had a big effect on everyone in Tunisian society, including Islamists. So it's very important to go country by country. We can say that there are shared commonalities, that all Islamists have some illiberal components in their program, but there is considerable variation. And I think that's why I get concerned that, in the media or sometimes from our politicians, we see a lot of lumping together of Islamists. And who did this recently? Tony Blair. Oh God, it was a disaster last week. I don't know if you saw Tony Blair's speech. He actually managed, and this is a remarkable feat, he managed to essentially say that Iranian Islamists and the Muslim Brotherhood are pretty much want the same thing, which is something that isn't quite correct, because Iranian Islamists are Shia, Egyptian Islamists are Sunni. That's a huge difference. Doctrinally speaking, very big difference. Anyway, I think it's very important to make those distinctions. Here and then here.
We had the recent example of President Morsi, who confused ruling with governing, and that turned out poorly for him. But was that culture, or was it religion? And if it was religion, then is there any prospect for democracy all the way from Mauritania, Morocco at one end to Malaysia and Indonesia at the other?
Sure. So, well, first of all, I think anyone who would have gotten elected in Egypt would have had a lot of trouble, a lot of problems. I mean, it's a very unwieldy country. Anyone who's spent time in Egypt, there's a joke, and I don't know if it's how true it is, but you hear this every now and then, and it's a kind of popular thing that people say, that the Egyptian government under Mubarak hired the Japanese to come in and try to rework their traffic system, because traffic in Egypt is just, it's remarkable how bad traffic is. So they brought in the Japanese as consultants to try to figure this out. And as the story goes, the Japanese were like, there's nothing we can do. Stick with what you have. There's no hope. And then they kind of moved on. But so that's one. But I think there is something unique about the ideological divide in the Arab world, and particularly in countries like Egypt. The Islamist secular divide is different. It is different. Because we're not just talking, again, about differing policies. So if you look at Latin America and the transitions there in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the primary divide there was economic in nature. That's tangible, that's material. You can split the middle on economic issues. The opposition can reassure the regime that their material interests will be protected. But when you're talking about religion, it's almost metaphysical in a sense. It's not tangible. How do you split the middle on religion? So in that sense, I think the transitions in the Middle East are in some ways more comparable to the revolutions of 1848 or the wars of religion in Europe centuries before that, because they're still dealing with foundational issues of the state. What does the nation state mean? What is the identity of Egypt? What is the role of religion in public life? Should the state be ideologically neutral or religiously neutral, or should it have a particular cause or a particular mission in society? Now, let's see how this manifests itself. So if you look at Egypt in the coup that happened on July 3rd, it was actually kind of remarkable to see how so-called Egyptian liberals responded to the coup. There was nearly unanimous support for a military coup on the part of Egyptian liberals. And obviously that doesn't make much sense because liberals aren't supposed to support military coups, right? And I'm starting this new project where I'm trying to look comparatively at coups in different regions. So if you look at Latin America, let's take Chile, which was a very polarized situation. 1973, Salvador Allende was ousted by a military coup. Some liberals supported the coup, some opposed it, but it was split. What's really unique, and I haven't been able to find anything comparable, is the unanimous support that we saw in Egypt. So that tells you something about how stark this divide is. And we can kind of get into that. Why did liberals feel the need to kind of turn against democracy and support the coup? I mean, part of it is that this issue of religion is raw, it's existential. So I went in August after the coup, I would tell my Egyptian friends, listen, coups are bad. We know this historically as academics. There's a whole academic literature on coups. Like, we don't care. We don't care about your academic literature. For us, we're the ones who have to live with the consequences of elections. We're the ones, our lifestyles will be altered significantly, maybe permanently, if Islamists stay in power. They're going to change the nature of the state. So if we have to choose between democracy and accepting that and changing our lifestyles, and there's also a class element here too, then we're going to go against democracy, and we're willing to accept that. So that's something that I kept on running into in my conversations in Egypt. And the other striking part of it too is to see liberals not just supporting a military coup, but supporting the mass slaughter of their fellow Egyptians. Now this is a whole different conversation of how can people who embrace democracy turn against it so quickly and essentially advocate for mass slaughter. And I actually had friends and colleagues tell me, wipe them out. That protest site, women, children, we don't particularly care. These people have to be eradicated. And when there were more than 600 people killed in one day, there were people actually cheering that on publicly, including people I know, Western educated, intellectual, smart. I had people on my Facebook wall essentially calling for mass execution. I mean, and that's a weird thing to experience. I mean, we study in graduate school about the rise of fascism and all of that, and we kind of read it from afar. But when you actually confront that head on, it's a very disturbing thing.
If you accept your statement that we should accept illiberal democracies, how do you ensure that the institutions survive and allow for the second and the third and the fourth election? I think Iran is a good example where you have elections, but maybe they're not as meaningful.
Yeah. So Iran is interesting, but I don't think it's quite applicable here because the Iranian Islamists did not come to power through democratic elections. They came to power through revolution, and revolution by its very nature is radicalizing. Revolutions can and often are brutal, and that's what happened in the 1980s under Khomeini. Now, there is this debate. What if Islamists come to power through democratic means only to end democracy as we know it? So that one person, one vote, one time. Now, I suppose you could speculate about that, but it's actually never happened in history. There is no recorded instance of Islamists coming to power through democratic elections and then canceling elections. Now, there's no way to know for sure what will happen in the future, but I think we also have to be careful about not basing our policies and politics based on speculative fears. And if we are concerned about those things, then, as you, I think, alluded to, we have to take seriously checks and balances, institutions. There are ways to promote more consensual ways of governing. For example, don't use first past the post. So first past the post or single member districts is what we have here in our own congressional elections, which is very majoritarian. It encourages zero-sum politics because if you win 51%, you get the seat. And the guy who got 49% is out. In fragile societies, you don't want to do that. So proportional representation is the way to go. You can also talk about parliamentary thresholds. Some countries like Turkey have a parliamentary threshold of 10%. Israel has, I think, 1%. So changing those things can have a big effect on the final outcome. If you want to make sure that even small parties have representation and have a voice in the system, then you want to keep the threshold fairly low. Maybe not 1%, but let's say 2 or 3%. So there are ways to think about electoral engineering, if you will, and ways to design institutions to constrain and disperse power, to essentially encourage people to be more conciliatory and rule in a more consensual manner. Okay, all the way in the back, and then I'll move down.
I'm curious what your take is on the slightly different situation in Turkey, where you have an Islamist who has come to power through democratic means, and whether you kind of see anything distressing in Erdogan's more authoritarian tendencies as he has gotten stronger relative to the military as they've gotten weaker.
Yeah. Turkey is a fascinating case. It's a problematic case because it used to be the model. That's what a lot of, the Turkish model, this is the way to go. The Egyptian Islamists should learn from what the Turkish Islamists did. So essentially, just very briefly, Turkey's Islamists essentially became neo-Islamists or post-Islamists. They really kind of downplayed the Islamic components of their message, and they now self-define as conservative Democrats or Muslim Democrats. So technically they're not Islamists, but they come from an Islamist background, so it's quite relevant. Now, Turkey is actually a very good example of how repression can lead to moderation. So what the Turkish military and the kind of secular system did in Turkey, they banned one Islamist party after another, pretty consistently over decades. Each time, Islamists would form a new party that was more moderate or more secularly oriented than the one before. So we do see this kind of trajectory. Now, as Turkey has become more democratic, you see Islamists, or neo-Islamists, let's call them, actually moving further to the right. And you see this particularly now with Erdogan. So what did he do in the lead up to the last local elections? You probably all heard about him trying to ban Twitter. Didn't really work so well. And then calling his opponents traitors and emphasizing more kind of religious issues, religious and cultural issues that are divisive in society. Now, you might ask, why did he do these things? What's going on here? But what I think is very interesting is that let's look at the results of the local elections, which happened on March 30th, so just a couple weeks ago. The ruling party, Erdogan's party, the Justice and Development Party, also known as the AK Party in Turkish, actually increased its share of the vote in local elections. In 2009, they got 39%. On March 30th, they got around 45%. So doubling down on your conservative base actually seems to work. Why? Because again, these are deeply polarized societies, and Erdogan is asking himself, what's the point of moving to the center or trying to convince secularists to vote for me when they kind of hate me and these attitudes are very entrenched in society? Again, this is the Islamist secular divide. The center is very weak. So you don't move to the center if there is no real center. Now, I think this is likely to backfire on Erdogan down the road, but for now it seems to have worked from a strictly electoral standpoint. We're going to have to see. I mean, if Turkey is going to be very interesting to watch, because here you had a secular system, a very strict secular system, and now you see Islamists pushing against the limits of the secular state. They're trying to erode those limits that have been imposed for decades by the secular establishment in Turkey, which I think raises the question, can you truly expect Islamists to permanently give up their Islamism? They can give it up like they did in Turkey for a decade or two or something like that, but once they have the opportunity, they're naturally going to want to reflect these sentiments in public life. So here and then here.
Yeah, hi. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the anti-monarchical strain, or at least that's how it's portrayed, especially in the Gulf, of the Muslim Brotherhood, and sort of maybe contrast some of the treatment of the Muslim Brotherhood in some of the Gulf states, so the really hard line against them, in the UAE or Saudi Arabia. And then the embrace potentially that you see in Qatar, a bit of
Sure. So having just come back from Qatar, where I was living for over 4 years, this was a pretty big thing. So the Saudis and the Emiratis in particular have taken a very hard line against the Brotherhood. Just last month, Saudi Arabia designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, unprecedented, because there has been some toleration of Muslim Brotherhood-like individuals and groups within Saudi Arabia, but now there seems to be a concerted effort on the regional level to pretty much destroy the Brotherhood. The Saudis see this as an opportunity to deliver a decisive blow against an organization which they see as an existential threat. Now, why do they see it as an existential threat? The Brotherhood combines two things that the Saudis really don't like. One, they're the only organized challenge to Saudi Arabia's religious legitimacy. They offer an alternative religious legitimacy, and Saudi Arabia takes this pretty seriously. It sees itself as the custodian of the two holy mosques, of the kind of leader of Sunni Islam and that sort of thing. They see the Brotherhood as challenging that religious legitimacy. Two, the Muslim Brotherhood believes in Islamization through democratic elections. The Saudis don't like democratic elections. That's a double threat. So just combine those things and you start to understand why this is seen as a real threat to some of these Gulf monarchies. Now, the Qataris are a little bit different in this respect, and they actually, so when the Arab Spring happened, and I was living there at the time, they saw Islamists as the wave of the future. They saw that these democratic openings would lead to Islamists coming to power. So part of it was pragmatic, that this is the way the region is going. And part of it was they didn't have the same ideological opposition to Islamism. That doesn't mean that the Qataris share the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology. It just means they don't oppose it in the same way that the Saudis do. Now, the Qataris are coming under a lot of pressure for this position because Doha is kind of an opposition. It's like the Mecca for the Egyptian opposition exile. There's a bunch of Brotherhood members and Salafis running around, and they're setting up shop now in Egypt, which is it's really interesting in that regard. But that's angering the Saudis. It's angering the Egyptians, and they're saying, why are you hosting these Brotherhood officials in exile? We have a big problem with that. So that's where the spat is right now. They're trying to mediate and negotiate. We'll still have to wait and see how that turns out. Sure.
In trying to understand Islamic fundamentalists, would you entertain the possibility on a very basic individual level that people who are brought up and schooled intensely in a religion that believes not only existential questions, but the most detailed questions about how one lives one's life is already answered by the Quran and the Prophet, that in a way that renders it unnecessary for them to think about certain issues and make personal decisions about them, that such folks would fear greatly the sorts of freedoms that we envision that confronts them with all those decisions.
Sure.
Does that make?
Yeah, it makes sense, definitely. So I think here it's important to make distinctions between groups like the Brotherhood and Salafis. Salafis are actually textual literalists. The Brotherhood and groups like the Brotherhood are not textual literalists. So there's much more space for interpretation. And that's why the Brotherhood is sometimes accused of being too pragmatic. They kind of go back and forth a lot. They're a little bit vague about what their ultimate vision looks like. But essentially, I mean, there are a lot of details in the Quran, but when it comes to governing, there's a lot of flexibility. So there has to be some level of interpretation, regardless. And that even goes for Salafis, who are in some ways becoming more pragmatic the more they engage in the political process. Does that mean they're becoming more moderate? Not necessarily, but being in politics means you have to learn how to make at least some compromises. Now, in terms of their educational background, what's interesting about groups like the Brotherhood is that their leadership is middle or upper middle class and quite well educated. So most of the Brotherhood leadership have PhDs. Now, granted, they're in things like engineering and medicine, which maybe isn't as conducive to open thinking as the humanities and political science, which is my discipline. But still, I mean, and some of them have studied in the U.S. and have their PhDs from, actually, one of the prominent leaders who's in exile in Doha now got his PhD from Purdue, speaks fluent English, and is somewhat Americanized. So, I mean, their educational background is interesting in that regard. Now, how open are they to kind of Western-style freedoms? So I would say that the Brotherhood has come a long way from where it was in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Even, for example, on women's rights, they're still illiberal. They don't believe in full gender equality, so there's a limit to how far they'll go. But, for example, now they're willing to support women in most senior positions, with the exception of head of state. But now, in the last 10 to 15 years, they've been running female candidates for parliament. That's not something they did before. They used to be very reticent about cooperating with secular groups. Now they, in many countries, form coalitions with secular groups if there are shared interests. Protection of minority rights. They're not maybe where we would like them to be as liberals, but they have come a long way on the rights of the Christian minority, again, relatively speaking, compared to where they were 30, 40 years ago. So you do see this trajectory. So it shows, now you might say, well, they might revert to their original conservatism, and that may be true to some extent, but it shows you the degree of flexibility and their openness to shifting positions if they feel that's in their interests. So it's not as if Islamists are immune to interest-based calculations. They're at least partly rational actors. So they respond to certain incentives and pressures in society. So two back here, yes, a blue shirt, yeah.
Yeah, you had said that that us in the West maybe need to think that if Islamists or democracy is going to work in the Middle East, that it has to be, somewhat illiberal. I was just curious, I know for us there are a lot of rights stateside that are non-negotiable, left and right agree, So I was curious, I guess, what things do you believe that they're going to have to give up, basically, or that
Yeah.
they're going to have, that we would have to be willing to be okay with them having in order for democracy to work in the Middle East? What things specifically are going to be different in a democracy over there versus over here that's going to work?
Okay. So this also just reminds me of something I wanted to say about the previous question as well, and it fits into this broader debate. Is there something distinctive about Islam? So I've talked a lot about Islamists. I tend to avoid talking about Islam as a religion. Islam is ultimately what Muslims want it to be. And obviously there's a wide variety of experience and practice there. But, one thing that we have to kind of contend with is the question, is there something distinctive about Islam that makes secularization or the privatization of religion more difficult? And I'll just say that I do think it's a little bit more challenging because of how Muslims perceive the text. So to be Muslim, you essentially, at least theologically speaking, you have to believe in the divinity of the Quran. So not that it's inspired by God, not that God inspired it and then someone wrote it, but that this is literally every single letter directly, unmediated from God. Now, this makes, and also the fact that Prophet Muhammad there wasn't this tradition of leave unto Caesar what is his, as we have in Christianity, but Prophet Muhammad was both a politician, a theologian, and a warrior all at the same time. So if you look at this original generation of Muslims, there wasn't a separation there. So these are things we may have to think about. Now, what are the non-negotiables in these societies? What does this kind of look like in practice? And you said that here in the US, I think, there are things that the right and left all agree on as non-negotiables. That may be true for most Americans, but even here we have some of these debates where on the state level, because of the democratic process, you see groups advocating illiberal outcomes. Whether it has to do with the rights of certain minorities, the gay community in some of these countries don't have full equal rights. That's one. Also, if you look at abortion rights, where does that fit in? How far should elected governments on the state level go? Some of them want to ban abortion altogether. Then you have the Supreme Court has to kind of adjudicate on these kinds of controversial issues. So even in our own context, we see this push and pull. If you look at other democracies, I think India is fascinating in this respect because the person who's about to be elected prime minister in the largest democracy in the world is not just a liberal, but, supports, or some would say, has been complicit in genocidal acts against the Muslim minority. What happens if he's democratically elected? Israel, which we consider to be one of either the only or one of the only democracies in the Middle East, is you have the rise of right-wing religious parties that do see a distinction between Orthodox Jews and secular Jews. So this is not unique. It's just a question of how far do you go? Where do you draw the line? What can popular majorities do? And where do you draw the line and say, even if you have 90% of people voting for this, it's not acceptable because it violates certain fundamental rights. I think to some extent, each society has to decide what those non-negotiables are. There are things that we can probably all agree on. Genocide is not acceptable. Killing people is not acceptable. Those are the obvious ones. But there are others that are actually quite difficult, and it requires a kind of push and pull. And I would, I would just kind of say one more thing on that. I want to just hypothesize very quickly what an Islamic democracy might look like in like 60 seconds. So, so in Turkey, we have a very strict secular system. So parties that are based on religion are not allowed, and the courts can dissolve those parties, as has happened many times before. And we see Turkey as a positive case. An Islamic democracy would be sort of like that, but in reverse. So, for example, liberal parties could participate freely in the democratic process, but only so long as they accepted the centrality of Sharia. So just as Islamist parties today in Turkey have to accept the secular Turkish state, you would just have that in reverse. What would we think of that? So, for example, a court in this Islamic democracy could conceivably dissolve a secular party if it becomes too secular. Now, that might seem to us as oppressive and unjust, but it really is the mirror image of what we have in some secular states. So, granted, we don't have a lot of models of how this actually works out in practice, but again, I think we have to think about these possibilities.
I want to thank Shadi for his excellent remarks, and we have a reception and as well as a book signing, so if you have any other kind of questions, comments, he'll be out there selling the book as well as signing, and there's a full reception, so thank you very much.
Thanks so much.